Hi, everyone, and welcome to First Draft. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And every week, this is when I talk with journalists and authors about their important work. Today, I'm so pleased to welcome Richard Bell. He is a full professor of history at the University of Maryland. He has also published 4 books and numerous articles. His latest book just came out on November 4th. It's The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Welcome, Richard.
Susan, great to be with you. Thank you.
Well, I thought that this was such an interesting book to come out. Of course, we're approaching the 250th birthday of America, and so it seems apt for us to go back to the beginning. And your book really covers so many things that I think tend to be left out of traditional history classes. I recall, being somewhat shocked when finally we got into history when I was in junior high and high school, and to realize that the American Revolution was not just, a bunch of ragtag Americans, fighting the redcoats and overcoming insurmountable odds. That, the French, for instance, had a great deal to do with our victory. And there were so many other global factors involved than just, our personal fight for freedom. But you do such a beautiful job of going into a lot of the stories that often get, left out of a lot of history books about immigrants from around the country who were part of this effort. And you also describe the American Revolution as a world war in all but name. And so I felt like that would be a good place for us to start and to talk about kind of what your research uncovered.
So thanks for the great question. A world war in all but name. That's exactly right. So this is a brand new history of something we think we know well, like you said, right? It tries to overturn sort of very familiar, very comforting myths that it was just the rebels versus the redcoats, that it was David versus Goliath, and that's the only story that's worth telling here. There's actually lots of stories worth telling here. And we could look at, for instance, all the people that rushed to North America to participate, sometimes voluntarily, think of Lafayette and Steuben, or sometimes involuntarily, think of all the conscripts and the rented German soldiers we called Hessians, for instance, on King George's side. So this is a, multinational, multi-ethnic, polyglot, pluralistic set of warfighters in North America. And then there's the rest of the world, right? This war ripples out from places like Boston and Philadelphia and Saratoga to really sweep up, first of all, the whole of the continent. Indigenous people are not spectators here. They are active participants with their lives and livelihoods on the line here. We know that Black Americans are swept up into this war, making it into a freedom war. And then we just keep rippling outwards, So we can think not just about, Boston and Philadelphia, but think about, Belize and Belfast and Pondicherry and Prussia and Peru, not just about New York, but Nassau in the Bahamas or Nicaragua. And even not just Charleston, South Carolina, but Cape Town, South Africa, Ceylon, as it was then called, the Cape Verde Islands. This is genuinely a war that ripples around the world and upends millions and millions of lives. It'd be weird to call it the First World War, because I think that would confuse me and other people as well. And also it would annoy my colleagues who study the 7 Years' War, who they say that war 10 years earlier is the First World War, but it's a world war. We've forgotten that story, I think.
Yeah, I know. Probably we spent some time talking about, well, the French Revolution was, was certainly inspired by the American Revolution. And full disclosure, that was my area of study in college. But, that's just one of many impacts of the American Revolution, as you really, so interestingly lay out here. And I thought the other the other myth that I think gets punctured is, we Americans like we like mythology quite a bit, and so there's kind of this idea of, yes, David versus Goliath, but the victory was inevitable. We were on the side of right, they were on the side of wrong. But really, when you go into detail, in your book, you talk about how, as with so many things, the victory was the result of, improvisation and a lot of improbable choices, and that's how we got there. And I think that that's kind of an unsettling concept for a lot of people in America, but that I think gives us a much more well-rounded understanding of the American Revolution and what unfolded.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, if I was to try to persuade you that I'm really smart and I know some long words, Susan, I would say this is about teleology and this is about contingency, right? That we shouldn't just read the past back from the present and therefore assume that everything that creates our modern world was inevitable back then, that actually things on the ground moment to moment are deeply unknowable, deeply messy, deeply confusing. Think about our own lives and how we're navigating. Can you see the future? I can't see the future, and historians make terrible predictors of the future, by the way. So instead, people on the ground are trying to stumble their way through their lives, through the darkness of difficult choices, and there are all sorts of highly contingent, improbable choices. Just to take the most famous example, which is France, of course, one of the critical difference makers to the Patriots' final victory is the effort they go to bring in foreign allies, namely the French and the Spanish, and others too, but I'll focus on France just for my answer here. And it is actually deeply weird when you think about it, that American patriots, a band of, let's see them how the French would have seen them, a band of anti-monarchical, anti-imperial, Protestant insurgents seeking a deal with the second most powerful empire, the most powerful king on the continent, who has his own empire, his own monarchy to protect. It's super weird that they, find a common interest here. But the common interest, of course, is beating Britain, their common ally. But it takes a real effort by patriots like Benjamin Franklin, who goes to France in 1776 to lobby Vergennes, the foreign minister, and King Louis to do that. King Louis and Vergennes have to convince themselves that this is right for France, not right for the patriots. That's not their interest. What's right for France is what makes the difference here. And then the patriots have to sell that alliance to ordinary patriots back home, right? So, okay, so you're saying we're now in an alliance with the country we've been told to hate for the last century. We're now in an alliance with a Catholic king in league with the Pope in Rome, and we have been brought up as good Protestants in the British Empire to believe that he is the Antichrist. And now we're in bed with him? That takes some selling, right? So it's a very improbable alliance, and we've forgotten just how weird and unusual that sort of thing is. Wars make for strange bedfellows, Susan.
They certainly do, as we know.
Yeah.
You also claim that the American Revolution, gave birth to our modern, multicultural, and interconnected world, and just talking about broad concepts like global capitalism, modern democracy, migration flows. Could you talk about, the link between non-American participants, in the revolution, as being a link to, the system of global capitalism or modern democracy as we know it today?
Yeah, sure. So, all these folks who end up as war fighters in the North American theaters, maybe I'll focus my answer on Hessian soldiers, for instance, people from the German states in this answer. They're sent there against their will. They're sent there by German princes who've rented them out to King George. And they're sort of, they don't know where they're going. They don't know why they're being sent there. They don't have much choice. So they're not really mercenaries. They're not soldiers of fortune. They're sort of renter soldiers there. And the Americans are initially terrified of these arriving Hessians. They They whip up a lot of, xenophobic, anti-foreigner sort of rhetoric to demonize these arriving German soldiers fighting on the king's side. And then when the Patriots finally beat some Hessians at the Battle of Trenton in December of 1776 and take, I think, more than 1,000 of them prisoner, they actually get to talk with them, and they realize these are not like men monsters who will cut your throat for a penny or two. They're just normal working class Europeans, right? They actually have a lot in common with the American working class who's, fighting on the Patriot side in this war. And thanks to the work of my friend Ken Miller, who wrote a brilliant book about these interactions, there is a prisoner of war detention site in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where these Hessians actually put to work on local farms working for German American patriots. And that rapidly thaws this sort of, anti-Hessian culture that's been building up around the Hessian presence. And many Hessians either choose to desert the King George's war machine by the end of the war, about 5,000 of them. Some others just get stranded there when their princes won't pay to bring them home, so desert by default, which is wild. And what that means is there's a bunch of former enemy soldiers now seeking naturalization in what's become the newly United States. And that's something the new Patriot government is largely receptive to. We do see an effort to sort of forgive and forget at the highest levels. We see George Washington and Alexander Hamilton talk about sort of peace and reconciliation as the goal coming out of the war. To forgive and forget, to sort of move on, to build a brighter future together, and for naturalized, newly minted German Americans. This is the start of a bold new experiment building a strong German American presence in America, and we see similar things on the economic front as well. This is a war fought over free trade, that Americans should make their own decisions about who they trade with and not be subject to the whims of maybe a mad tyrant king or something like that. And after the war, we do see American ships spread in all sorts of new directions. I'm thinking of the ships that go to Canton, China, right after the war, the ships that go to India right after the war that have previously been banned because British ships are the ones supposed to be going there. So we see all sorts of opening up. We see a sort of cultural opening up after the war. We see an economic opening up. There are other forces pulling in the other direction, of course, but generally speaking, America opens its doors in the years immediately after the American Revolution.
And you brought up the example of the Hessian soldiers, but there were also others like Caribbean slave labor and like Chinese tea growers. I mean, this really was a multicultural effort. Can you talk with us a little bit about how they fit into the picture during the war and after?
Yeah, let me talk about maybe Black people here for a moment. I'm happy to talk about Chinese tea growers as well. They, of course, are implicated in the story of the Boston Tea Party, right? Which is it's the Chinese tea packed by Chinese peasants, which is motivating the Boston Tea Party. We could talk about that. But the role of enslaved people and Black Americans more generally has been the subject of a flowering of scholarship within universities in the last 20 years. And I don't think yet all of that amazing research has really broken through into the public conversation about America 250. So this book, one of the things it tries to do is to give those folks the attention they certainly deserve. One way to see the American Revolution is as an opportunity for enslaved people of African descent to claim real freedom for themselves, not a political slogan, not simply a change of government, but not be chained up and beaten anymore. And so we see, for lack of a better word, an insurgency among enslaved people, both in the 13 rebel colonies where enslaved people, for instance, at George Washington's Mount Vernon, they flee George Washington and they go to join the British Army because they think the British Army is going to be a better deal. It's going to give them lifelong freedom after Britain wins the war. So they're gambling on a future they cannot see, to return to some of our earlier thoughts. And in the Caribbean, too, there are slave uprisings in 1776 and multiple other times, where basically enslaved people are using the chaos of the war while their enslavers are distracted to seek actual freedom from slavery for themselves. So to think of the American Revolution as a great turning point in African American history that is, at least in the same conversation as the Civil War and the War of 1812, I think is a great new way to understand how freedom in different meanings of freedom and liberty sort of ripple around the world during this 8-year war.
And it's, one of the great distinctions between the French and the American revolutions was that slaves were actually freed in the French Revolution. And of course, that was not the case in America. We had to wait decades to fight that last war. And you can make the argument that we have not completely finished that either.
Yeah, I would certainly make that argument. It's an unfinished revolution in that sense, which, by the way, is the title of the recent Atlantic magazine special issue, which does a good job of incorporating some of these stories here. So I think that's precisely right, that for Black folks, this is a momentous occasion. For Indigenous people on the frontier, they see this as a last-ditch opportunity to try to slow down the path of white westward settlement here by playing off the two sides within the British Empire, the Patriots and the Crown and the Loyalists, against each other. Many Indigenous people wade into the war, typically on the British side, not because they love King George. They don't love King George. No one likes King George. They do it because they have their own interests here, right? That King George is their best bet to enforce the proclamation line, the line on the map that says white settlers should not be going past the ridge of the Appalachians. And again, they are gambling, Susan, that Britain will win the war, and they gamble wrong, of course.
And of course, prior to the American Revolution, you had the French Indian War, and so you have the continuation of those conflicts as well. So certainly, I can understand why many of them didn't really think that France and America together was a great ally for them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. One of the outcomes of the French and Indian War is that by the end of the French and Indian War, the British government has managed to attract some indigenous nations towards their banner, towards their flag, having been, really outnumbered by the French and the France's Indian allies, native allies early in the war. British strategy is to peel off those native allies from France and attract them to the British flag, largely by strangling trading relations between France and the indigenous. And so what that means is when we fast forward to the American Revolution, 10, 15 years later, Britain actually has a relatively warm, relatively friendly relationship with certain indigenous groups. And so when those indigenous groups have the option of picking sides in the revolution, they tend to go with the crown and tend to cut against the patriots, who they see as squatter settlers and land grabbers. So the indigenous folks are trying to hold back that tide. And of course, Britain loses, which leaves indigenous people largely stranded without significant international allies. They can no longer rely on France, as you point out. They can no longer rely on Britain because Britain's surrendered and gone home, which leaves indigenous people after 1783, the war ends, to fight on alone against what is now the United States. And so the war continues after 1783 on the frontier in Native America, in Indian country. And it won't be until the 1790s where there's any sort of resolution, and it's not a happy resolution for many indigenous people.
We talked a little bit about how, it's an unfinished revolution. And so certainly for Black Americans, also for Native Americans, how does that impact the country 250 years later when we still have many of these issues festering below the surface and in many ways right out in the open?
As you're asking that question, I was looking on my actual real bookshelves behind me. This is not a virtual background people might be looking at. And seeing if I could see a book I wanted to show you. And I can see it. It's right there. I'm going to grab it. 1 second. This book is not by me. It's by my friend Robert Parkinson, who teaches at Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton. It's called The Common Cause by Robert Parkinson. Check it out. It's a big, thick book. It will keep you busy for a while. One of the many things it does, and it's a brilliant book, it won all the prizes, is it argues that when Jefferson is writing the Declaration of Independence and the editors in Congress are then, chopping up his draft and making it into the final version, that they end up with language that demonizes Native Americans as merciless Indian savages. That's a direct quote from America's Declaration of Independence, and demonizes black people who've sided with King George and the Redcoats as domestic insurrectionists. And so that language pitches we, the patriots, as forming an American identity, forming one people in opposition to the British people and in opposition to indigenous people and to African descended people. So the vision of who's an American in the Declaration of Independence, Susan, is someone who is not British, not black, and not native. And I think that language of exclusion, even though the Declaration is not the Constitution, even though it's not the system of government, it's just a press release, that language of exclusion is in the founding documents of this country. And so it's been very hard to sort of look past that language of exclusion over the last 250 years, which is why it's still a work in progress to guarantee inclusion for these valuable fellow Americans who live amongst us today and have done since the American founding. So in that sense, it's still very much a work in progress to look past beyond some of that xenophobic rhetoric of the 18th century.
You've also discussed how the fight for freedom was actually catastrophic for many populations around the world, with plummeting living standards, mass starvation. Can we talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, we should. We have to, right? So the global effects on ordinary people, think of the working class around the world, for instance, are catastrophic because this is a war. It's not just men prancing around giving speeches on white horses, which is sometimes the image we sort of carry with us in our heads, right? This is not a bloodless war. It's a bitter civil war within the 13 colonies. We've completely forgotten the loyalists, right? We just assume everyone was a patriot, which is just nonsense. And the economic effects for anyone who's trading with either the American colonies or Britain's Caribbean colonies or Britain or Ireland or India are catastrophic because all that trade vanishes during the war years itself. So if you are an Irish farmer, if you are a British manufacturer, if you are an enslaved person on a Caribbean slave labor camp, everything is thrown up into the air when trade ceases and everyone goes to war. And when livelihoods are threatened, that's when prices rise, that's when goods become scarce. And by goods, I mean necessities like the food you eat. In the Caribbean, for instance, enslaved people were fed by food deliveries from the mainland colonies for decades before the war. And those food deliveries cease because Britain is at war with its colonies, right? So those food shipments can't get through. And that means that enslaved people in the Caribbean starve in large numbers. We see similar problems in Ireland. In Britain, loads of people lose their jobs who'd been in the import-export business. The same is true in America. There's the shelling of various, peacetime communities. There's a big piece this week in the Washington Post about the shelling of Norfolk, Virginia, in the war during the American Revolution. So this is a civilian catastrophe, Susan, as any major war is always going to be. And so to pick up the pieces when the war ends is very difficult. Things don't just snap back to normal as soon as someone signs a peace treaty, right? So real damage to the lives of the Atlantic working class and the enslaved underclass around the Atlantic Rim, I think.
And of course, that's not a story that, we spend an awful lot of time learning about in the history classes. Obviously, I'm sure all countries, center themselves, but we in America tend to be very good at that. And so it just is focused on, our fight for freedom. And of course, any price that was paid was worth it. But when it affects millions of people around the world, obviously, it's more than necessary, to do this sort of research, to look at the effects, because, as you mentioned, nothing just snaps back into place after such a monumental war. There are effects in the immediate and for decades and centuries to, afterwards.
I think that's
I'm,
right, Susan. If you don't mind me just jumping in, no, I'm so sorry. I think you've really hit your head. You've hit the nail on the head of something important there, right? So every country tells sort of heartwarming nationalist myths to its young people, to its future citizens, right? For the purpose of nation building, for the purpose of creating, useful patriotism, a usable past, as we say in the business here, right? When I grew up, I was told similar stories about how Britain single-handedly defeated the Nazis in World War II. Did you know that? It was single-handed, right? Just Winston Churchill and his buddies. So very similar sort of narrowing stories. And I don't think America is unusual or exceptional in engaging in that. But I also think, we are adults and we're capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time and holding complicated thoughts in our heads, especially when those complicated thoughts reflect the realities of the historical experience of millions of people around the world. And as we enter, America 250, as we're on the precipice of this big anniversary, I think it would be a really wasted opportunity if we just went back to the sort of cartoonish David versus Goliath, rebels versus redcoats script, when we all live today in this entangled, globalized, transnational world. Of course, people in the 18th century did too in their own way. And to forget that and to put, this moment in American history up on a platform so that it's somehow separate from world history, I think is a huge missed opportunity. So my book tries to offer a correction.
And of course, we're in a time in America where there is resurgent nationalism, especially primarily on the right. And we are in a political war for how we're telling history, where we have the president who is actually trying to make decisions over what exhibits are in the Smithsonian museums. And so, we have a current fight over what our history is, who gets to tell it, who gets to be centered. And so as we enter America 250, suddenly just, books like yours that painstakingly research the time of the American Revolution, the impacts around the world, there's definitely a political movement that does not want to have that perspective, that wants to have, it be, it was the good guys versus the bad guys, like it's, a Marvel movie and we won, and to the victors go the spoils, and the end. And let's not talk about, what happened in the Caribbean with Black people and their sacrifices and their role in any of this. We've seen silly backlash to Hamilton, which was, of course, a fictionalized account, but attempted to take a more multicultural approach. And of course, anytime that happens, there's a lot of criticism that you're rewriting history, and, history was the white founding fathers, the end. So where can we go when, it's not good enough just to present facts, when you're running up against the politics of the time, and that kind of militant nationalism is an increasing part of our politics here?
Yeah, I leave a lot of contemporary politics to others with real expertise in this. I try to stick to my lane of someone trying to honestly, reconstruct the past here. But what I will say to folks is that let's go back to two of our most famous and most important and justly celebrated founding fathers, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, two men I deeply admire, by the way. And despite this funny British accent, I'm a naturalized US citizen. And, one of the things I've come to admire about George Washington from writing this book is to realize just how much he was invested in and entangled in this globalized world I'm reconstructing in the 18th century, and how he was certain from the war's beginning that the best way for his army, the Continental Army, to succeed was with help from whoever would offer it, whether that be indigenous actors, if he could persuade any of them to come to his particular side, which was sometimes a tough lift. If he could persuade, out of work, unemployed European officers like the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron von Steuben to come and lend their considerable expertise in, artillery and engineering and drilling, for instance, to his ragtag army, or if it's in partnering with someone like Benjamin Franklin, the great diplomat of the American War, to formally bring in actual allies, the armies of France and Spain, the navies of France and Spain. Washington is crystal clear that that is the path to victory. He says it over and again. Franklin is then his hand, his instrument, doing that in Europe. So the founding fathers, right, our patriot leaders, they knew from the beginning it was never America alone. It was always going to be America among if we're going to stand a chance. You can't look them honestly in the eye, Washington and Franklin, and not see that in their surviving papers. So I think that's a powerful lesson.
It is, and it seems that we have a movement of isolationism, not unlike what we had a century ago. And of course, that has been impacting some of our recent foreign policy. But that does seem to be a stark contrast to what our founding fathers did intend.
I think that's right, Susan. So I'm thinking of a letter that Washington sends to Baron Steuben right at the end of the war. Baron Steuben, everyone remembers, is the Prussian drill master who comes and sort of Europeanizes and shakes up the Continental Army at Valley Forge, one of the iconic moments in American history where we actually recognize the contributing presence of a foreigner, right? In this case, an out-of-work Prussian soldier who may well have been gay, by the way. And Washington writes to him after the war and says, yeah, dude, I couldn't have done it without you, right? You are the guy who made the difference to me when I needed it most. And then to pick another example, in 1778, Washington is again at Valley Forge, and in May of 1778, he gets news that Ben Franklin and King Louis have just signed the military alliance, bringing tens of thousands of French soldiers and French sailors and French ships and millions of dollars worth or francs worth of supplies into the war. And I say dollars worth. The dollar is a Spanish currency, by the way, so we use Spanish money too. There. And George Washington's troops lose their mind with joy that the cavalry might be on the way here. And they stage this elaborate sort of Thanksgiving parade in May, not November, in May of 1778 to give thanks to France entering the war. And it's called a feu de joie, which is a French word for a fire of joy, where they all set off their guns at the same time and they all bellow in unison, "Long live the King of France." And this is all at George Washington's behest, of course, right? It's a reminder that international allies and the presence of people from other countries, including plenty of refugees, by the way, during the war, are critical to getting the Patriots where they need to go. So this is a geopolitical earthquake, and the Patriots have worked to build something like a coalition of the willing.
So after the American Revolution, we did have, as you know, a lot of people who, went on to seek naturalization and to be part of America. And obviously that became, this blueprint for our melting pot that we have here in America, where it hasn't been a straight line that everyone has been welcome, but, certainly we have, drawn from all corners of the world, and as opposed to many countries in Europe that have been homogenous up until recent decades, much more so. But what I'm wondering is that the unfinished question always was that of slavery, and that was not dealt with at the end of the war, and we had to wait almost a century to have another war over that. Was there any path forward to really deal with that question then, so that was not part of the legacy of the founding of this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think scholars like Robert Parkinson, who I've cited earlier in this conversation, I would generally subscribe to his view that it's not an inclusive vision for survivors of slavery at the founding. That has to be fought for and contested by Black Americans for generations and generations to come. So I think of the free black radical David Walker in 1829. I think of Frederick Douglass. What to the slave is the 4th of July. Why should we get excited, we Black Americans, especially enslaved people, about your holiday when you go off about liberty and equality? Well, liberty for whom? Equality for whom, right? That's a conversation Douglass wants us to be having when we have our hot dogs and buy mattresses at big discounts on July 4th. So it's Black Americans who lead the charge in that fight to expand the vision of the American settlement. If you look at the actual terms of the peace treaty that our greatest diplomat, Benjamin Franklin, signed with Britain in 1783, there's actually some dark stuff in there about slavery, which we've chosen to forget. There's the equivalent of a fugitive slave clause in the 1783 peace treaty, which says that any enslaved person who's fled to the British lines, to the British Army during the war, on the promises that Britain will make you free when Britain wins, all those runaway slaves or self-emancipators, to use modern language, they can't leave. When Britain leaves, they have to stay. So the enslavers, like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, can come to New York where the British Army is, and as soon as the British Army leaves, they can sweep in, round up any fugitives from slavery from places like Mount Vernon and drag them back into slavery. That's a really dark moment in the peace treaty, but Ben Franklin was doing his job, and that's what American slaveholders wanted him to do. In fact, he had a buddy on the commission in Paris, a guy called Henry Laurens. Maybe they weren't buddies, but they were certainly working together. And Henry Laurens, the 4th American peace envoy, is Charleston, South Carolina's largest slave trader, and it's him that writes that fugitive slave clause into the treaty. So in the same way that we have to reinvent the Constitution to find in it something that reflects the country we actually want to live in, we have to undo the 3/5 clause. We have to undo and overwrite, the preservation of the slave trade clause. We have to undo and overwrite the slave revolts clause, etc., in the Constitution. And we do that in the Civil War through the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the second founding. They also have to undo that nasty term of the Paris Peace Treaty. And it's enslaved people, Susan, who will do this. Enslaved people in British-occupied New York learn that the provisional treaty has a fugitive slave clause in it, which is going to see them rounded up, re-enslaved, and recaptured or punished if the final treaty is signed. They can't stop the final treaty being signed, but they can and do lobby British commanders on the ground to simply ignore that part of the treaty, which would see them re-enslaved, and evacuate them to elsewhere in the British Empire. And black lobbying is what makes that amazing story of what happened next possible, because British commanders on the ground in New York agree, under considerable pressure from black lobbyists, to remove them from the path of re-enslavement and put them on British naval transports to go to Nova Scotia and London and other places too, where at least they will be legally free in what's left of the British Empire. And we see several thousand black refugees escape revolutionary America to build new lives in what remains of the British Empire. I should say, for the record, given that I have a British accent, Britain treats them abominably in Canada, but it does not re-enslave them. So you can make of that what you will. Glass half empty, glass half full. But the alternative seemed much worse.
Well, Richard, I really appreciate you taking so much time to speak with us. And your book is just fascinating. It is out now. It's The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. And I know that you are coming to all places in America on your book tour. So hopefully you will be able to listen to him talk about his book in person. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks very much. My pleasure. I teach at University of Maryland, and I'm going to hit the road in the spring. So check my website if you want to learn more. Thank you very much, Susan.
Wonderful. And we will, in the write-up of the show, we will put your website there so that people can find you.
Thank you.
Thank you.